Hi, this is Professor William Grodman, and this is our review for General Psychology 1, Exam 1. We started off this semester, Fall 22, talking about psychology, the definition of psychology, the study of behavior and mental processes. Behavior is observable, measurable. Mental processes are certainly not observable. Psychology today focuses more on biological factors. And in fact, there were some foundational aspects of this going back to the 1870s, which is really sort of the beginnings of the field with Wilhelm Wundt, who developed the first psychological lab. Sigmund Freud was a neurologist by training and the father of psychoanalysis, really developed developed that, which is really the first psychotherapy in the late 19th, early 20th centuries in terms of the beginnings of it, the origins of it. Contemporary psychology looks more at empiricism, an objective evidence based approach. And research is typically either experimental, looking at cause and effect, or correlational, looking at relationships between variables. The domains of psychology are pretty broad based: biological, cognitive, developmental, social, personality, and some others. Academically and in terms of practice, the number one subfield of psychology is clinical psychology. Let's talk about some terms associated or additional terms associated with research. A hypothesis is a specific prediction or theory which is testable. And then there are some variables that are typically outlined and part of psychology research, particularly with regard to experimental research. When you talk about independent variable or variables, you're looking at, it is essentially referring to that which is being manipulated and studied by the researcher or investigator. The metric to look at the effects of an independent variable, such as a drug or a therapy, is called the dependent variable or variables. If you take a large population from a much smaller population, or actually a small population, I should say, from a much larger one, this is called random selection. The actual sample is called a random sample. And in the experimental design, you typically have random assignment in which those people who have been randomly, or those subjects who have been randomly selected, will then be randomly assigned to one of two groups: a control group, in the case of a drug study, getting a placebo or a sugar pill, to control for expectations. That expectations don't affect the study. The people, subjects, and actually even the experimenters who are directly involved will not know who's getting what. So you don't know who's getting the placebo in the control group or who's getting the actual drug, for example, in the experimental group. The drug is sometimes referred to, of course, as the independent variable or even the treatment variable. So you have the control group getting the placebo in a drug study, and the experimental group getting the actual drug that's being tested, also referred to as the independent variable. We talked about specific areas of research. Just to highlight one or two, I would say for the purpose of your exam, you should know, as we spoke about, something about schizophrenia, which is sometimes falls under the heading of psychosis. And the prominent symptoms of schizophrenia are hallucinations and delusions. You don't have to have both. One or the other will meet the diagnostic criteria for this disorder, this very severe mental disorder. Hallucinations are sensory experiences or processes that other people don't experience. Most common being auditory hallucination, hearing voices or seeing things that other people don't see. Visual hallucinations. Delusions are grossly distorted belief systems, such as thinking you're God or thinking the FBI is out to get you, when in fact they're not. And there are people they do track, so it's not necessarily delusional. So the clinician would have to inquire accordingly. The role of biology and psychology we spoke of. There are some basic foundational terms we talked about: neurons or nerve cells or / brain cells, neurotransmitters, chemical agents which carry signals from one neuron to another, and they influence emotions, behavior, and cognitions. In fact, we spoke about common neurotransmitters and their associated functions. For instance, acetylcholine, connected to motor control or muscles, attention, sleeping. And we even reference the loss of acetylcholine with Alzheimer's. So it's not only a loss of neurons, which we'll speak about in a second, but also deficiency or loss of the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Norepinephrine, another neurotransmitter associated with arousal and alertness. Serotonin, you often hear about this, connected to mood, one's emotional state, and if you're serotonin deficient, you may very well be depressed. Dopamine, yet another neurotransmitter connected to motor control, thought, and some ways emotions. So schizophrenia, there is an excess of dopamine. By the way, disorders such as Parkinson's, there's a deficiency of dopamine. Endorphins are an opiate-like chemical produced by the body to reduce pain, so they're connected to pain reduction, and they also increase pleasure. In terms of the structures of the brain, more specifically, the three major structures of the brain, the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. Hindbrain has several structures and functions. We spoke about the medulla, a substructure dealing with vital reflexes such as breathing and swallowing. The midbrain associated with movement. The forebrain, several functions and associated structures such as the thalamus, which relates to sensory processes except for smell. The hypothalamus, relating to thirst, sex, sleep, hunger. This is somewhat akin to Freud's ID. We spoke about that too. Hippocampus deals with learning and memory connected to the forebrain, and with Alzheimer's, as noted, loss of hippocampal neurons. Amygdala, another structure of the forebrain dealing with emotional memory, such as being attacked or some other trauma. The outer part of the forebrain is the cerebral cortex, and this is divided into four areas. These areas are also referred to as lobes. And, for example, there's a frontal lobe with multiple functions, such as thought, emotions, and language. The temporal lobe with hearing and understanding language. The parietal lobe, sensory processes. The occipital lobe, relating to the recognition and perception of visual objects. So if there's damage to the occipital lobe, you may not recognize a person. There are a lot of reasons why you may not recognize someone, but it could be neurobiologically based, such as damage to the occipital lobe. The brain is also divided into two hemispheres. The left hemisphere is predominantly language-based, such as vocabulary, general knowledge. The right hemisphere is more nonverbal, examples such as creativity and imagination. But it would be a misnomer to say that we're left-brained or right-brained completely, and that information goes back and forth between the hemispheres via a structure called the corpus callosum, or corpus callosum. We then talked about consciousness, our awareness of our internal and external world, or when sometimes we're not conscious, things are unconscious. There's a lack of awareness of what's going on internally and externally. Sleep is often associated with unconsciousness. Attention is typically associated with something that's conscious when we're focused on specific information. A hormone associated with, speaking of sleep, a hormone which influences sleep, melatonin. And there are different stages of sleep. 3 non-REM, typically rapid, we're referring to non-rapid eye movement, and also typically not associated with dreaming. There's N1, person is drifting off to sleep, N2, you're asleep, and deeper sleep, N3. They refer in the text to REM sleep, rapid eye movement, as stage R, which is typically associated with dreaming. In adults, about 20% of our sleep is REM sleep. Over the course of a night, you go in and out of REM about 5 to 6 times. And there's also reference to REM sleep being sometimes called paradoxical sleep. The paradox or contradiction is you're asleep, but your brain is very active. There is no concrete or conclusive evidence, or at this point, a way to absolutely define what a dream means psychologically. We know we dream a certain amount of time, about 20% of sleep in adults, more so in children, and even a little bit more in infants, close to 50%. But it is a view held by most, even physical scientists such as physicists and chemists that dreams do have psychological meaning. You think about, you reflect on dreams, you think about themes in dreams. But there are perspectives or people who adhere to a perspective that dreams are just random neuronal activity. And there's a name for this position or perspective. It's called the activation synthesis hypothesis. The activation synthesis hypothesis. You've also probably heard, we're talking about dreams and sleep, you probably heard about sleep deprivation, when you are deprived of sleep, sometimes in an acute manner, sometimes chronic sleep deprivation. And sleep deprivation has many effects. It can affect mood, you become more irritable. It can affect memory, diminishing memory, long-term and short-term, reaction time, processing speed, even health. So that if you are sleep deprived, it may suppress the immune system, making you more vulnerable to disease. There are many sleep disorders, including difficulty going to sleep or maintaining sleep, insomnia, sleeping excessively, hypersomnia, obstruction of sleep, difficulty breathing, sleep apnea, extreme daytime sleepiness, narcolepsy, sleeping or sleepwalking, which is associated with non-REM sleep, more common in children, and of course that is sleepwalking. Oh, throw one more in the mix: night or sleep terrors, in which you are not in REM sleep and you may wake up in a very distressed manner but don't have a dream. Also, by the way, nightmares are associated with REM and more common in children. But just to mention that as well. We spoke briefly about, the chapter addresses some categories of psychoactive drugs which affect consciousness. Stimulants, cocaine, nicotine. These are drugs that certainly can affect behavior, mental activity, reduce appetite. Depressants, such as alcohol, can decrease behavior and mental activity. Opioids, reduce pain, and increase pleasure, can be highly addictive, such as heroin and morphine. Hallucinogens certainly affect perception and consciousness, thoughts, emotions. LSD is a classic example here. And when you hear the term or see the term substance abuse, it generally speaks to something that is affecting your life. So a substance which is creating some change psychologically and socially for the worse. But there may not be, and probably is not, dependence. You don't have physical dependence. When you see a term such as substance dependence or alcohol dependence, or any other drug in which dependence is referenced, this involves a physiological dependence, which is sort of broken down into two types: tolerance, where you need more and more to get the same, more and more of the substance to get the same effect, or withdrawal, which is you no longer use the drug and you have these associated symptoms such as cravings, nausea, chills. Those are withdrawal symptoms. The general goal of treatment with regard to substance use and abuse, for that matter, is abstinence. And there are different levels of treatment. Inpatient, where someone might need to be, probably would need to be detoxified. There's also, on an outpatient basis, counseling from either a drug counselor or a psychotherapist or other, maybe a clinical psychologist or psychiatrist, in which you are working through issues connected to your substance abuse challenges. And then there's 12-step programs where it's a peer-run support group such as Alcoholics Anonymous. Last term, that is dual diagnosis with regard to substance abuse. It's simply referring to having a substance abuse diagnosis, such as alcohol abuse, and having a psychiatric diagnosis, such as some type of depression. Those two tend to be highly correlated. If you have one, you may have the other. It's not unusual at all. So we've hit some of the major terms that will hopefully help you prep for exam one. Again, this is a revision of the terms for fall 22. So make note of that. If you've listened to an earlier tape, that's helpful, but this one is most descriptive and will most parallel the exam you're about to take. Okay, we'll see you live, remote, online, or in school. Take care.